this computer. Okay. Move that over. There, take two. I'm going to just ask now that we know we have the recording in progress, if everyone is able to see my PowerPoint slides, the full slide.
Yep, it's good again.
Okay, excellent. Does it show that it's recording as well on your screen?
We got a message.
Okay.
Immediately saying that it was
Excellent.
recording.
Okay, thanks, Delane. Super. Okay, so I just want to officially welcome everyone to this noon hour session on an orientation to the competency-based fieldwork evaluation, the CBFE. This is really in preparation for Intermediate 2 fieldwork, although for some of you who may have an Intermediate 1 student, this will also apply for the most part. I also want to acknowledge Margaret Ann Campbell-Rempel, who was the original fieldwork coordinator who rolled out the CBFE and was responsible for the creation of all of the original material in these workshops. So thanks again just for making time in your day today to come to this session. I am going to be sharing my PowerPoint as well as at some point sharing the CBFE to show you the evaluation. And because I can't see the chat when I'm sharing my screen, if you do have questions or comments along the way, please feel free to speak out. I more than welcome your comments and questions as we go along. And I'll also make sure that by the end, we have an opportunity to ask questions as well. So before we dive into the CBFE, I wanted to provide you with a brief overview of our MOT curriculum, just to help provide some context for where your students are at when they're coming to you this January. So for some of you, this is a review, and for some of you, this is new information. So typically in our program, students in first year have 1 4-week basic fieldwork placement in November and December, and then they have an 8-week fieldwork Intermediate 1 fieldwork placement in the spring, in May, June. And our second year students have another 8-week Intermediate 2 fieldwork placement in January, February, followed by a 6-week transition to practice advanced level fieldwork in the summer. So these are the 4 placements that are typically spread across the program. However, last year with the strike that was taking place at the University of Manitoba, we were not able to do basic fieldwork in the fall. So that meant that instead students completed all of their academics, and then they went in and completed a shortened 3-week basic fieldwork placement and a shortened 5-week Intermediate 1 fieldwork placement. So what does that mean for our current students? So if we look at this year, our first years, the class of 2024, they're really on track to for a typical fieldwork schedule. Our second year students, our MOT2s, so the class of 2023, instead of doing an 8-week Intermediate 2 fieldwork, they're coming to you to do a 9-week Intermediate 2 fieldwork placement. And then instead of doing a 6-week advanced fieldwork placement, they'll be doing an 8-week advanced fieldwork placement. So this is to help catch up on some of the time that they missed. Essentially, they're coming into Intermediate 2 fieldwork with less experience than they typically would have. So what I would like you to see from this particular slide is an understanding of how students develop across the 4 placements. So our basic placement is a level 1 placement, and we say exposure, but we really do expect our students to start to get involved and to be actively involved in the therapist caseload. The acquisition stage, this middle stage here, is much longer. Typically, this is our Intermediate 1 and our Intermediate 2 placements. And these are the placements where students are really provided with much more opportunity to become involved in the educator's caseload, to practice skills, to develop their reasoning, to really consolidate all of their abilities before moving into the final integration stage, which is advanced level fieldwork. And that's their transition to practice placement. So we have these 3 stages. Another way of looking at these stages is how you see it outlined on this table. One of the key reasons I'm showing you this table is I'd like to highlight how the levels of fieldwork here, level 1, level 2, and level 3, really are in sync with the levels of fieldwork for the competency-based fieldwork evaluation. Level 1 being our basic fieldwork, level 2 being our intermediate 1 and 2 fieldwork, and then level 3 being our advanced fieldwork. Something to reiterate for intermediate fieldwork, where it encompasses both intermediate 1 and intermediate 2. So we refer to intermediate 1 as level 2A, and then we refer to intermediate 2 as level 2B. Are there any questions about that so far? So that's a quick overview of how our program is structured. So now what about the CBFE? So the competency-based fieldwork evaluation was developed a number of years ago out of the Western University. It was done in collaboration with their OT community. It's now really used in all but one of the English-speaking OT programs in Canada. It's also used internationally in Ireland, for example. It has been mapped successfully to our profile of practice and to the essential competencies. It's not yet mapped to the new competencies for OTs in Canada, and I will speak to more to that a little bit later. It's a copyrighted evaluation, which means that we have to follow some specific guidelines for how we share the evaluation with our students and with the community. And I'll speak to that a little bit more later. When it was developed, it was both field and pilot tested, and it was shown to have good face validity and was really seen to accurately reflect student development. Following the rollout, there was a study presented at CAOT showing that the CBFE really did typically measure students being ready to transition to practice at the end of their final placement. It also said that the current requirement of a minimum of 1,000 hours of practice really related well to students being ready to practice when they're ready to graduate. So this here is a busy slide that tells you how the CBFE has been mapped to the profile and the essential competencies. But we know now with the new competencies for OTs in Canada that there's potentially some gaps. So nationally, we're looking at how can we potentially rejig the evaluation or look at redeveloping it so that it fits with the new competencies for OTs in Canada. I think we need to look especially at the competency for culture, equity, and justice. So just to make you aware of this, stay tuned. There'll be more to come about how this is evolving over time. But right now, we are continuing to use the CBFE. Here are some additional resources if you are interested. These were created by Western University. One of them really speaks to the creation and the development of the CBFE, and the other one speaks to implementation. Just a word of caution that each university program really does apply the CBFE slightly differently. So if you are looking at external resources, just to be sure that you're aware there could be some differences in terms of how we apply it here at U of M. A few notes about accessing the evaluation and expectations. So just to highlight that it is a copyright form. So we've worked with the publisher to make some adaptations to the form. Knowing that it's copyright, we have an agreement whereby we ourselves purchase books, as well as each student's required to purchase their own copy of the CBFE manual. And that allows us to then share an electronic copy with you as educators. One thing that we are trying to do as well is ensure that every site has a paper copy of the manual. So if you have not ever received a paper copy of the manual at your site, or if you want to check and you see that you don't have one, please let us know and we will happily send you out a copy of the CBFE. Just another note in terms of expectations that this is a requirement to complete at midterm and at final. But overall, educators are not expected to indicate if the placement's a pass or fail. I'll speak to that a little bit more as we move on. But that whole decision about whether the student passes or fails really lies with the university. So moving on to the CBFE manual. I'm going to talk very briefly about the manual, and then we'll look at the evaluation in more detail. So the actual CBFE is not very big. The first section really speaks to the development, the history, some of the evidence, and the scoring. And then the rest of the evaluation is the manual is comprised of 2 paper copies of the evaluation. The evaluation itself is made up of 7 competencies. And then for each competency, there's a page for students to develop their personal learning objectives. Then there's a final overall score, which is not, and it's not really meant to be an average. It's more an opportunity for you to synthesize where you think the student's at in their development. So that's the structure overall. We have those key components, the 7 competencies that are evaluated by the educator and the student at midterm and final using a rating scale and comments. Then we have a learning objective plan or a learning objective page for each competency. And then the form, similar to our old eval, it also has some descriptive demographic information at the beginning of it. So what are these competencies? So these competencies that are in the evaluation are listed on the slide. Each competency does have what we call a competency descriptor that you'll see in the manual that provides you some insight into each competency. So practice knowledge, we see this as really our discipline-specific theory and knowledge. Number 2 is clinical reasoning. The 3rd competency is about facilitating change with the practice process. So really getting at all those aspects of how students start to learn and apply the OT process, from developing a therapeutic relationship with the client, receiving and managing the referral, assessment, planning, discharge, and follow-up. The 4th key competency is professional interactions and responsibilities, looking at the relationships with clients and colleagues and upholding legal and ethical standards. Competency number 5 is all about communication, written communication, verbal communication, non-verbal communication, sort of our core OT building block. The 6th competency relates to professional development. So really speaking to the students' self-directed learning and their ability to be accountable for their development. And then the final competency, number 7, performance management, really captures the student's ability and progress with respect to time and resource management and how they manage their practice. So these are the 7 key competencies. When we look at the evaluation, again, it's divided into 2 parts. So for each competency, we have a competency rating scale. And though that rating scale is what the educator uses to evaluate the student at midterm and final. Then for each competency, we also have student learning objectives. These are the student's personal learning objectives that they develop, which we also, both the student and the educator rate themselves on. So I think what I would like to do now is really just walk you through the form, just to try and give you a framework to understand the structure and what we're talking about with respect to these competencies and the learning objectives. Just going to minimize my screen here and pull up. Can everyone see a copy of this competency-based fieldwork evaluation?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Before I go into this form, are there any questions that are bubbling up so far? We're doing okay?
Okay.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. So each of you should have received, as an educator, a copy of this competency-based fieldwork evaluation electronic version. So you'll see in the first few pages are really descriptive. They give that demographic information and some information about the placement. So I'm going to move through that fairly quickly. Information about the placement history, the educator's name, your registration number. we have these boxes here, whether or not the student accepts their evaluation or not. This is not a requirement for them to fill out, but it wasn't something that we were able to modify being a copyright evaluation. And then we move into the competencies. So here's where what you'll see is that for each competency in the CBFE, there's one page that addresses that competency. Here we're looking at competency number 1, which is practice knowledge. What you see underneath here in these bullet points is what we refer to as the competency descriptors that give you some insight into what that competency is about. And then over to the right, you'll see the scoring and the levels. So for level 1, that would be your basic fieldwork placement. For the students that are coming to you for intermediate 2, they are functioning in this level here, level 2. That's intermediate 1 and intermediate 2 in this stage. And then level 3 is where we see our advanced transition to practice placement in the summer. So it gives you an idea of the different levels and the scoring. And then for each competency, you'll see this competency rating scale and how it looks at the student's development from being an entry-level clinician, entry-level student, sorry, all the way to entry-level clinician. So this is the rating scale that you'll be using to rate your student at midterm and at final. And the student will also do their own self-evaluation as well. And then you have an opportunity to provide comments at midterm and at final. So knowing that for intermediate 2, we're in this level 2 stage, which tends to be within the realm of 4 to 6. At midterm, you'll be considering and reflecting on your expectations for where you expect your student to be at by final. And you'll look at providing a rating. So if the student was at midterm doing well, on track for meeting your expectations at final, you would use the drop down to indicate a 5. And we'll talk more about the grading later and how it links to your expectations. And then at final, if the student was really satisfying your expectations and you felt that they were really ready to move on to level 3, advanced fieldwork for that competency, you would rate them at a 6. So you use this drop down to provide a rating at midterm and final, and then you use the comment section to indicate how the student's meeting that competency and some opportunities that they need to work on.
So Teresa, I just have a quick question. Sorry, I had my hand up, but I know it's probably hard to see.
Thanks for speaking.
And I don't know if, again, this is something we'll chat about later in the session. So, and I don't know who's all on the call and their kind of area of expertise and background. So being someone who would typically not rate someone in an OT program, I guess we will understand more and be trained to learn how to properly assess how they are potentially meeting expectations, because I would have general workplace expectations, but again, to know how that translates to where they are in the program, I wouldn't want to unfairly critique the students.
Right. So I'm really glad you brought that up, Delane, because that's your situation is unique because it's a role emerging placement. And in your role, so you've got yourself as the on-site facilitator, and then you have someone else who's the off-site OT educator. So in this situation, then it would be the off-site OT educator who would be completing and responsible for completing this evaluation and assigning.
Oh, thank goodness. Okay.
Yeah. And then, yeah, exactly. Phew. But you would be, it's helpful context for you to understand, like when Leslie's gathering feedback from you to help support how the students are doing, then you might link it to some of these key competencies or expectations.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. So I'm just more providing the feedback in my odd scenario.
Right, right.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad you asked that question. So that's the competency page. And then for each competency, we have the learning objective page that relates to that competency. So here we see student learning objective page specifically for practice knowledge. So this is the page where students develop their own personal learning objective related to that competency. We'll speak to that more later. I just want to start to sort of plant the seed in everyone's head that the students' personal learning objectives are not part of the overall pass-fail decision. There's more latitude in how they develop it, and it's not the responsibility of the educator to develop, but the student does collaborate with you to sort of help determine if it's something that's reasonable and doable in your environment. So at the bottom of this, their learning objectives on this page, there's a learning objective rating scale. And here's where, again, at midterm and final, you will mark on that scale where you think the student's at in terms of their progress towards meeting that personal learning objective that they've developed. Learning objectives don't necessarily have to all be met in one placement. So a student might actually carry one learning objective forward into another placement. There's a lot of flexibility that way with the learning objectives. So that's an example of how it would go for one competency. And then essentially, as the evaluation moves through, there's, for all 7 competencies, you'll see the one page with the competency rating scale, and you'll see the corresponding page for the student's learning objective related to that competency. And it really carries on that way for the entire evaluation for all 7 competencies. So you might just want to close your eyes for a bit while I quickly scroll to the very end. Once you get to the very end, there's an overall rating of your students' performance. So this is not, it's not meant to be an average per se, it's more meant to be kind of your overall synthesis of where you think the students at in their development. It's important to note that this particular rating is not included in the overall pass-fail decision. The overall pass-fail decision really looks at the average of the 7 competencies at the final evaluation. And then there's also an opportunity for directions for future learning. And similar to all comments, these comments are really helpful for students to help them think about what do they need to focus on for the next placement. There's also a checkbox for pass or fail. I just want to note again, this is something that we weren't able to remove from the form, but it's something that we've never expected our educators to identify. You certainly can fill this out, but it's not a requirement. Just want you to know that. The other piece is, in terms of signatures, this form can be a bit finicky. So we have had some experiences where as soon as educators sign the form, it locks it. So my word of caution now is just to wait until everything's inputted, until the final evaluation is completed, and then go ahead and sign the form. Are there any questions about this so far?
Yes, Gina here.
Hi, Gina.
So for Catherine and I sharing a student, do we each fill out an evaluation or do we do one?
That's a great question. So for when you're sharing a placement with another educator, sharing the student, you would still just complete one evaluation. Okay. So you would both get together to sort of think about the ratings and how they're doing in terms of meeting your expectations. Okay. And then write the eval together.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome. Any other questions before I move along? Okay. So I'm going to take us back. I'm going to stop sharing the form. Hopefully that helps you just to give you some context for what we're talking about. Hopefully now you're back to seeing my PowerPoint slide, right? Let me know if you're not seeing it.
We're good.
Excellent, thanks. So now that we've had some idea of the history of the CBFE and the key components with the rating scale and the learning objectives, I'd like to talk more about the competency rating scale and just how you go about setting your expectations and rating your students' performance. So how do you go about doing this? How do you set your placement expectations, and what are you really measuring against when it comes time to evaluate your student at midterm and final? So it's important to think about the basis of your evaluation for the CBFE is really based on the placement expectations that you set as a fieldwork educator. So there's a number of things that you're going to pull together to allow you to set these placement expectations and then to evaluate your student. So when you think about your expectations for the placement, it's based on the competency descriptors. That gives you some insight into the competency. And it's also based on the learning outcomes for the particular level of placement. So for each fieldwork course, there's learning outcomes that we've provided to you that really outline what we're hoping students to accomplish on the placement. So all of you should have received that for intermediate 2. And if you look at the learning outcomes across the 4 placements, you'll see how they iteratively sort of build on each other. So what we've done is we've taken this a step further for the CBFE, and we've created a mapping worksheet, which all of you should have received before this workshop. And this mapping worksheet really outlines each competency, and then it relates it to the learning outcomes for the placement. And then in the 3rd column, it gives you some sample expectations of what might be reasonable expectation for intermediate 2 related to that competency. And then the final column on this mapping worksheet is blank. And it's meant to be an opportunity for you then to start thinking about what expectations, knowing your practice setting, knowing your environment, and what opportunities are available for the student to think about what expectations might you have related to that competency. So this mapping worksheet is really intended to help educators link their placement expectations to the CBFE. So as you start to think about planning for your intermediate 2 fieldwork student, it would be, I think, helpful. We've had some positive feedback to go through that worksheet to start to look at each competency and some of those sample expectations and think about what makes sense for your environment. So just as a review, one of the things that's going to help you evaluate and set expectations is that competency descriptor. You can find it for each competency on the CBFE. And you're also thinking about yourself as the expert. So we know that you are the ones that know your practice setting the best inside and out. So you're really able to reflect on your OT role, your practice setting. What are some of those opportunities in your placement that you feel your student's going to have a chance to develop, and then also to demonstrate so that you can evaluate them. You're also thinking about what are the learning outcomes and the competency description. This slide really just summarizes again all of the things that you're pulling together to help you set your placement expectations. And again, we recognize that you are the expert, and I think that's really important to think about, is reflecting on all the different learning opportunities at your site. You might also want to look back at your fieldwork site profile that was created for this placement and look at what learning opportunities were addressed there. You want to consider those learning outcomes specific to the level of the placement. Consider that mapping worksheet that gives you some examples of expectations. Most importantly, I really want to stress that you want to keep in mind that you're setting minimum expectations for where you expect your student to be at by the end of the placement. So what do you minimally expect a student to be able to do to be rated at a 6 by the end of the placement? What does your student need to be able to show, to do on a regular basis for you to be able to say, yes, they've achieved your expectations at this level and they're ready to move on to a level 3 at advanced placement? So having those expectations is really important. It gives the student a roadmap for what you're thinking. And then it also really is helpful when it comes time to doing the evaluation, because you know what you're measuring your student against, and they know that as well. Are there any questions about this so far in terms of the rating? I'll assume we're doing okay. Okay. So when it comes time for the midterm and the final evaluation, you are going to rate your student based on your expectations and then place that rating on the competency rating scale. Your student is also going to do the same thing with their self-evaluation. So I just want to reiterate that point too, that your student has their own copy of the CBFE that they also do a self-evaluation on. Their version's the exact same as yours. The only difference is that at the end of theirs, they have a learning log that helps them track their learning throughout the placement. So here's just a paper example taken from the CBFE. This example is for basic fieldwork. So basic is level 1. And we know that the maximum for level 1 is a 3, which shows that the student's ready. They've mastered level 1 competencies and they're ready to transition to level 2. So you can see here in this example at midterm, the student was rated at a 2, which would indicate they were on track. And then they were rated at a 3, which would indicate that they were clearly meeting level 1 expectations by the end of their basic fieldwork placement. So what do we expect on the rating scale? If we think about the different levels, for level 1, which is basic, typically a 3 indicates mastery of that level 1 and ready to transition to level 2, so the intermediate 2 fieldwork. Then we have level 2, which covers intermediate 1 and 2. For this level, 6 is what we consider to be mastery of the level 2 and ready to transition to level 3 advanced fieldwork. We know that we have 2 intermediate placements within level 2. So typically we consider a maximum of 5 for intermediate 1, a 5 being that the student's ready to transition to intermediate 2. For intermediate 2, we consider 6 being the maximum, and a score of 6 by the end of intermediate 2 really is what we're expecting to see, reflective of a student being able to be ready to transition to level 3 to their final advanced transition to practice placement. Any questions about that so far? We're okay? So it's important to recognize that the pass-fail is based on the final ratings, and that the whole pass-fail decision is ultimately determined by the university, and it's looking at the average of the competency marks at final. So midterm marks are especially important because they indicate how on track your student is in terms of meeting final expectations, and it's an opportunity to flag sometimes when there's concerns raised. But ultimately, it's the overall average of the competency ratings at final that we use to determine a pass or fail. This slide provides an overall summary of the grading for each level. Let's take a closer look, though, at intermediate 2, which is what we're gearing everything toward. So what are the actual pass or fails? This slide provides a description of the competency ratings at final. So a score of a U would indicate very clearly that your student's performance is considered to be unacceptable. By the end of intermediate 2 fieldwork, a rating of a 3 would indicate, again, that your student's level of performance is unacceptable for intermediate 2. They're still more functioning at a level 1. If you have a student who is rated with a score of 4 at the end, this would be reflective of a student who is experiencing difficulties for intermediate 2 placement expectations. A score of 5 at the end would mean that your student's nearly meeting intermediate 2 placement expectations. And if you've rated your student at a 6 at the end of intermediate 2, a 6 reflects that your student's clearly meeting your intermediate 2 level expectations, and they're ready for that competency to transition to level 3. And it's important to note that 6 is the maximum grade. Sometimes educators are tempted, if they feel their students really excelling, they want to put a higher grade. If you want to note that you think your student's quite exceptional in a competency, you can always reflect that in the comments. So when the evaluations come back to the university and I'm reviewing them, what I'm really looking at is the average of the 7 competency scores. So if the average is 5 or above, the student will probably pass. If it's between 4.6 and 4.9, then the student would probably be flagged for review. And if it's 4.5 or lower, the student will probably fail. So the reason I say probably is that there are some exceptions. So say, for example, if the average is a 5 or above, but there are some comments that are especially concerning that really don't support the rating, then that would be a concern that I would flag. Sometimes if there's one competency that's particularly low, that would also be another concern. Anytime there is a student's evaluation that's been flagged for review, that essentially means then the decision is no longer something I can make. I would take that to the progress committee, and the decision for pass or fail would go to the progress committee. And that would involve me reaching out to you to get a sense of the placement and how the student was doing. I'd also be talking with the student and pulling all that information together to bring forward to the progress committee. So when I share all of this information about grading, it's not that I want you to be thinking about exactly, what grade does a student need to pass. I just really want to provide it to you so you have that context of what we're looking at when we review the grades when they come in. I do recognize that some students are completing intermediate 1 in January as opposed to intermediate 2. So I've put this slide up here as well. The descriptions are fairly similar, just to highlight that for intermediate 1, the maximum is typically a 5. And then of course, the average of the expected average on the 7 competencies is slightly lower than what we would expect for intermediate 2. Are there any questions about the grading so far? Or questions at all? Okay. So that covers the competency and the competency rating scale of the CBFE. Now that we have a sense of that, I'm going to speak more to the student learning objectives. We sometimes call this the student learning contract or the student learning plan, their personal learning objectives. This is about the student's learning, and it's really much more under the control of the student. So what happens in the first week of placement? Students at the intermediate level are required to develop a minimum of 1 competency for 1 learning objective for each competency. The idea is that they're meant to be additional or augmentative to the regular placement expectations that you're setting for the student. It's the student's responsibility to develop these learning objectives. Your role as an educator is really to help them determine if it's realistic or doable in your setting. So by the end of week 1, they'll share their objectives with you, and then you can provide some feedback or maybe some tweaks as to whether or not it's actually realistic and doable in your setting. For basic, we only have students develop 3 personal learning objectives across all the competencies, but once they get to intermediate and advanced, they're required to develop a minimum of 1. Both the student and yourself as the educator will rate your student on their progress with their learning objectives using that learning objective rating scale. But again, it's important to keep in mind that the rating on the student's personal learning objectives is not part of the overall pass or fail. Something else that's important to keep in mind with the student learning objectives is that in order for you to be able to provide that rating, you need to have some context. And so we ask students to work with you to ensure that in some way that their student learning objectives are copied into your version of the evaluation so that you can then accurately rate them at midterm and at final. This slide just reviews some key points that the learning objectives, it's not numerical, it's not part of pass or fail. Students can carry their objectives over into other placements and into practice. It's really about what the student wants to learn that's relevant to the placement. And your role as the educator is really thinking about what's realistic and doable in your setting. Students are required for filling out the 4 columns on those learning objective pages. One of them is the goal itself. One of them relates to resources. So they have to think and be specific about what might be required of them. What do they need to help them meet this objective? And they also need to think of the evidence. So how will they demonstrate that they're meeting this learning objective? And the validation. So the validation really gets at how, who, and when will this validation occur? So say, for example, if your student has an objective related to being able to self-reflect and identify their strengths and weaknesses, their validation, one strategy for validation might be feedback from their educator. It might also be self-reflection or documentation in their journals as one way of validating that they've been able to meet that learning objective that they set for themselves. This page here is just taken from the CBFE. This is an example related to practice knowledge of that learning objective page and how the student will fill out each column related to what they want to learn, sorry, I do that every once in a while. What resources they require to help them meet that objective, what evidence, what proof will they have to show that they've met that objective, and then how they want that evidence, that objective to be evaluated. And then, of course, we have our learning objective rating scale at the bottom. So that's learning objectives. So we've really covered the key components. We have the competencies and the competency rating scale. And then for each competency, we have the student personal learning objectives that they develop for themselves. All of these are evaluated at midterm and final. The learning objectives, however, aren't part of the overall pass-fail rating. Any questions so far about that? Okay. So now that we know what's being evaluated and the different key components of the CBFE, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the process of evaluation. So in terms of student expectations, we know that that first week, once students get a sense of your environment and what's available, by the end of week 1, they'll develop a minimum of 1 personal learning objective for each competency. And they'll do that in collaboration with you just to get feedback from you as to whether or not it's a reasonable objective. Then both at midterm and final, your students will do their own self-evaluation. So they'll complete the CBFE for themselves, and they'll provide themselves with the numerical rating as well as comments for each competency and for each objective. And then your students are also going to complete the fieldwork experience evaluation form. They do that at midterm and final, and they're responsible to share that with you. So that's the expectations of the student. So when you come to your midterm and final meeting, they'll share their self-evaluation, and they'll also share their fieldwork site experience form. And then for you as the educator, your key expectations are to set those minimum expectations. So what you minimally expect your student to be able to accomplish related to each competency by the end of the placement, and to share that with your student. And then to, again, kind of collaborate and give some feedback with your student as they develop their learning plan and their personal learning objectives. And then at midterm and final, you will take that opportunity to provide that rating on the competency rating scale and on the learning objective rating scale to give them feedback about all of that. So it's really those three forms that are reviewed at midterm and final: the student self-evaluation, your educator evaluation on the CBFE, and then also the fieldwork experience evaluation form. Sometimes educators find it helpful to give their students a copy of the evaluation beforehand, so they have a little bit of time to digest it. Students can do the same for their self-evaluation. Then when you come to the midterm meeting, you both feel like you have had some time to think about some of the comments and the feedback. Not for everyone, but it's one strategy that does work for some. A reminder as part of the process that you're not expected to indicate if the placement's a pass or fail, that's something that ultimately the university would make a decision about. If there were concerns, especially, we'd be in touch with you. And as always, if there were concerns on a placement, I especially want to encourage you to reach out sooner than later. Even if something's niggling at you, it's much better to address concerns sooner than later. If we can flag issues for students at midterm, it helps us to support both you and the student to start to work on plans for possibly how we can help the student work towards meeting expectations by final. Yeah, and then by the very end, once the placement's all wrapped up, that's when we need the forms. You don't need to send anything to us at midterm, but at final, once all the evaluations are complete, we just ask that you email OT Fieldwork the student self-evaluation, a copy of their fieldwork experience evaluation form, as well as a copy of your evaluation of the student using the CBFE. So those three forms, if you could email OT Fieldwork and copy in the student so they have a copy as well, and they know that you've sent it to us, that's what we need to get from you at final. This is just an extra note about the copyright piece, which we've already talked about. If you do want a manual, please let me know. You can even just let me know before the session ends today. This slide just speaks to tricks and tips. I'll leave it for you to read, but just to forewarn you that with the CBFE, it can be a fickle form sometimes. And so some sites particularly have had challenges with the save feature. So it's best to use the save as feature each time you go in and work on the evaluation. If you are really struggling with the form, please reach out to us. We can help you troubleshoot. And also, if it's just not working electronically, paper copy is also really doable. Your student is able to take their manual and make a copy for you. And then one option is you could email your evaluation back to us. But by all means, if you're having issues, we know you're busy and there's lots going on in your day. So we don't want you to be struggling with that form too much. So that brings us to the end. I'm going to stop sharing right now and just see if there's any questions that have come up along the way. One thing I do know is that it's a lot to digest. And as you start thinking about planning for having your students come in January, that different questions will pop up. So please, as you have questions or any concerns, or you want some help setting expectations or planning for your student, you know where to find us. We are literally just a phone call or email away. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're more than happy to help you plan and work with you so that it can be a good experience for everyone. I also just really want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day, which I know is a very busy day, to come and attend this session. So thank you very much. And thank you for offering intermediate too. I'll be looking forward to connecting with you in the new year as you've got your students in fieldwork with you.
Thanks, Teresa.
Very welcome. Thanks again. Bye, Delene. See you. Bye, Kimberly.